Hey everyone, I'm Lucas,
And I'm Ethan.
and we're at least going to try and teach you HTML, CSS today. We're going to be using a framework called Bootstrap that's going to make everything look a lot nicer, and that is just a really easy framework to work with. But we're going to start sort of with the basics of all of this. So essentially, HTML is what all the web is built with. It stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's used on every site on the web. Now, for most web browsers, you can actually see this. It's literally just plain text. If you right click on essentially any site, for Safari, you have to like do this little enable developer tools thing. But if you click inspect element, you can look at the code that goes behind any element on any website. So for example, here's Facebook and Google, and you can see it is just text. And it's sort of remarkable that from text, you get these very, very elaborate sites. Hopefully we're going to bring some sense to how that works. But the truth is you could build an entire website in like TextEdit or Notepad++ or Microsoft Word or any text editing program. But ultimately, it's much more difficult because there's a lot of these different elements and attributes and what we call syntax, which is essentially, if in English, grammar like characterizes sentences, syntax characterizes how we code. Essentially, it's rules that make sense and meaning or bring sense and meaning to pages, sort of. I'm getting a little jargony right now. Most of this is not super important. We're getting into the weeds right now, but in essence, basically, your life is going to be a lot easier when you're building anything with HTML if you use what's called an integrated development environment, which stands for an IDE, and that basically just means a piece of software that will handle your code in a way that's nice. You can see all of these are three different popular coding editors: Visual Studio Code, Brackets, and Atom. All of them are roughly the same in terms of compatibility. There's also countless others. All of these are free, cross-platform, and open source, which is why I have them on here. But in essence, what they will do is they will just make, they're going to color code things for you. They're going to help you with alignment. They're going to make things a little more logical. But the truth is you could, once again, do this in a text editor. But so that you can follow along, because we want this to be a very interactive tutorial, we're going to be using an IDE. Visual Studio Code, VS Code, is like arguably the most popular among them right now, which is why we're going to teach it to you. I personally am like sort of fanatical about open source, and Visual Studio Code is open source, but Microsoft adds like trackers and other binaries on top of the versions that you can download. Like you can see their source code, but the actual final like applications are like essentially have stuff in them. So I use what's called VS Code, which is just, or what's called VS Codium, which is literally VS Code, but skinned. It really doesn't matter. I'm saying this only because it will look slightly different than if you're using vanilla VS Code, which is totally fine. But here's the links to download both of them. The VS Codium download's a little more involved, which is why I'd probably recommend if you're new to HTML, you do Visual Studio, like just regular VS Code. But this is a long interlude. We can sort of start coding. So this right here is VS Codium. The way we're going to start is we're going to click Add Workspace folder. I'm on my desktop. You can create these anywhere, but we're going to call this HTML CSS tutorial hack at home, just for clarity. So you see we have this little thing here. This represents a folder, essentially. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to create a new file, and we're going to call it index.html. This is purely a matter of convention, but yeah. Now Ethan's going to do sort of basic document structure.
Yeah, and one important thing to note is like in VS Code and in VS Codium, you can just click that like little button. But if you don't have that, there are a lot of ways to create files. You can do it within the IDE, or you can open up your terminal, Lucas, if you want to do that now. And like a kind of universal way to make a file is to just do like, in this case, it'd be touch index.html.
Yeah, or we should also, so one thing you have to do is you have to navigate to two folders within terminal. This is like sort of a little above the level of this, but so like so for example, I am in the like home folder right now. It says work. That's the name of my user on here. If I click ls, it'll give me all of the files on here. And then cd, if I do cd desktop, that I believe, what does cd stand for?
Change directory, and ls is short for list.
Okay, yeah, so if I change directory, now I'm in desktop, and now from desktop, I can see, and I have this thing, cd, HTML, CSS, tutorial, hack at home. And now if you see we list it, we have this index.html in there, but I could do like touch index.html, and that will create the folder. Now there's two of them, which is kind of a mess. Or like touch main.css, which actually is useful to us. And you can see it came up right here also.
Yeah, and if navigating those files is a little bit confusing, because in all reality it really is, you can just like, once you navigate to your desktop, you can just like use the visual interface and drag and drop as you like. So, all right, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is declare in the file that this document is an HTML file, and we're going to do that by typing in doctype HTML. And now,
or I was going to say VS Codium also will like autocomplete what you're doing essentially, which is
yeah, that's why you're going to see things fill out. Next, you're going to want to create your holistic opening tags, which will be HTML. So this is already, we're looking at basically like the main structure of HTML, of just HTML, where you have this opening tag up on line 2 and the closing tag on line 4. Obviously, those tags will have more added in. That won't matter. You'll just have more things inside of it. And everything, for the most part, will be contained within these tags. And you'll know which tag is connected to which because they'll have the same name. And then the closing ones will have that backslash there. So next, within our HTML, we're going to want to make a header tag. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So within our head tag, we're going to have some important kind of like background tags and background information for our site that we won't really be actively using and interacting with, but will be really important to kind of like load preset information into the site. So this is where we're going to, like Lucas talked about, load in a lot of our Bootstrap stuff, as well as fonts, and link our main.css style sheet. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is where like a lot of the kind of background magic happens. So if we just want to fill that out now. For now, though, we'll just be linking our main.css file. And this is just common HTML syntax etiquette.
Oh, shit. Rel equals.
You don't want the space in there either.
Yes, you're correct.
It doesn't matter, but Nick's gonna.
Help me out here. I always Google it when I do it.
Yeah. Oh, it is. It's going to read link rel equals style sheet in quotation marks, then href equals main.css. Again, in quotations.
And so we should also say that main.css is referenced here because it is in the same folder. So let's say that I had a separate folder, then you might have something like, folder 2, and like essentially this represents a file path to your main document. We're going to keep it simple here, and we're just going to have all the documents in the same folder. But that's what this main.css is referring to. It's linking this. If I hit follow link, it'll take me to this document.
Yeah, and next, usually what follows after the head tags are the title tags. This is usually just one line, and the title tag is the title of your website. It's usually going to go out of the head tag, or should it? It should stay in.
I think so.
Yeah. Perfect. And for now, that's all we're really going to need to do within our head tag. All right, so the next is the body tag, which is followed after the head. This is where basically you're going to be doing all of your coding. This is where we're going to put our nav bar. This is where we put our images, all of our text, all of our text boxes, anything like that is all going to go into the body element. Yeah, and then afterwards, usually it is important to include some like closing information. This isn't usually seen on the website, but you do want to have footer tags that go underneath your body.
You'll notice every single one of these tags is opened and closed, and essentially it refers to everything that's in between them. So like these tags essentially make up all of the groupings and elements of a site. Some tags are self-closing, but the vast majority of them have one that's opening and closing, essentially.
Yeah, and this is the basic structure of an HTML website. That's about it.
If we were to open this up within, now let's do that so that I don't have any of my stuff. If we were to open this up, what this might look like is we would just open up index.html, and you'll notice that it just says, hi, I'm the title on top, and there's no content. What we could do, however, though, is we could add an H1 tag, which stands for heading 1, and say something like, hello world. And if we refresh it, you get that. And you can do this with all like sorts of elements. So there's like H1 through H6 tags. So H2 will be like slightly smaller, for example, than H1, and so on. It goes all the way down to H6. And then you also have P tags, which are paragraph tags. For example. And you can see they already have some style attributes, like some styling to them, like, just in terms of some are different font sizes. But we can also change this within the individual tags. So you'll note that this thing says link rel equals style sheet and href equals main. These are attributes in HTML, essentially. And what they mean is we're setting the rel of link, the relationship of the link, to style sheet, and we're setting the href, the hyperlink reference, to main.css. And you can do this elsewhere. So for example, we could do h1 style equals, and then we could have something like font size 12 pixels. And now this h1 tag up top is now 12 pixels tall. As you might imagine, though, this is really sort of cumbersome if you have a lot of style elements of like a normal site. So another thing we can do is, we mentioned this main.css that we've linked. We've basically said that they're related. We could say, all right, well, we want all H1 tags to be font size of 12 pixels. And it's the same. It's exactly the same. It hasn't changed. But we also could, do 96 pixels or something, and then it's going to be huge. And there's a lot of different elements and attributes you can apply. Ethan, do you want to do selectors?
Yeah. So as I'm sure you're already wondering, well, we have these like generic ways to kind of like get these specific tags like H1, H2, so that all H1 font sizes now are going to have a font size of 96 pixels. But what if we have an H1 tag that we want to have specifically be 96 pixels, but we don't want that to be like an overall like a universal trait of the website, or we want to make an exception for one H1. This is where selectors come in. So what we could do for the H1 hello world now is we could give it a selector by giving it like ID equals, in quotations, and then whatever name we want to associate it with. So selector example, big text. Yeah.
And
great.
So like now, look, if you see we have these, I've just changed this tag also to an H1. So you'll see they're both exactly the same. If I make this 40 pixels, they both go down together. But if I make big text a font size of 96 pixels, then the one on the bottom will stay the same and small, and the one on the top will go big.
Mm-hmm. There's also another selector that is commonly used called class. Yeah, and so the next thing we're going to do for our second H1 is give it a class of blue text. And so this is actually another example of a selector. If you go back to the main.css file, we are going to access it a slightly different way with a period instead of a hashtag. And then we can assign it the color of blue. And that's how you do that in CSS. We'll dive more into that a little bit later. And you'll notice that only this class, or only this H1 tag with the blue text selector, class selector, is blue now. However, it gets a little bit messy if you're kind of like freely interchanging between ID and classes. And so usually the etiquette is your classes are for more general, but still more still specific CSS traits that you want to assign to like a certain area of your site. And IDs can allow for like easier exceptions and things like that. Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Example,
but oh, sorry.
Sorry, for example, I've just assigned blue text to these lower 3 elements, and they all return blue. And I also, you can assign a class and an ID to certain elements as well.
Yes.
Now, the relevant question then becomes, well, what happens if, you know, this H1 tag, it has a class of blue text and an ID of big text. What happens if I give it conflicting information, like I tell this to make the color red? And essentially, we have in HTML what's called specificity, where essentially these generic like H1 labels are the least specific, then classes, then IDs, and there's like other things that change the hierarchy, like inline styles, like we were doing before. Like if I did this, like style equals, you know, font size 14 pixels or something is the most specific, then IDs, then classes, and then types. But so like, for example, since an ID supersedes the class, it'll go red.
Yeah, and so there's just a lot of ways to organize your code and ways to access specific things. And, you know, being able to override traits and attributes is built into HTML. So you're very much allowed to specifically tamper with things. There is a set structure to kind of keep you organized, but as we've kind of shown you, like your website's not going to break if you only use classes, and your website's not going to break if you only use IDs. It's just going to be a lot harder for you to write the code. And in terms of readability for other people who might want to read your code, it's going to be a lot harder for them to understand what it is you're doing and or trying to do if there's a bug. So like these built-in structures and hierarchies, while they like at first glance might appear to kind of be the same thing, are really like important for you as a reader. But yes, so this is like a little how-to on selectors for like basic ways to access and style your code. And this is basically the structure of every HTML and CSS website that you'll ever see. I mean, some websites will include JavaScript, which we won't get into here, but this is how most websites are built. Obviously, there's a lot more bells and whistles. This is only like 20 lines, but this is really everything. There are a lot more tags that we're going to go into, and there are a lot more CSS options, including little animations that we can go into, but this is it. Hopefully it's not too daunting. We'll just continue showing you guys all the tools that you have access to.
Yeah, so one thing we're gonna use is what's called Bootstrap. It's essentially a framework that gives you a bunch of built-in CSS and a bunch of built-in JavaScript, which is essentially a coding language that lets you manipulate sites more. We're not gonna use it, but Bootstrap has it built in. And one thing that's great about it is you can just Google something like Bootstrap Template, and it'll take you to this. This is the official Bootstrap site, and if you go to documentation, you can find their starter template. And so we're literally just going to copy this in to index.html. You can see a lot of things are very similar. This here, it's importing CSS. Instead of importing it from our computer, it's importing it from their site. There's also these script tags, which are importing JavaScript. Once again, we're not going to get into it, but it's happening. It's implementing, or it's bringing in these different libraries, jQuery, Popper, and then their Bootstrap stuff. The one thing that is missing here is it's not importing our CSS file from before. So we're just going to do that the exact same way. But now you have this. And if we go back to our folder and we do this again, and so if it isn't working for you, you should right click it, hit open with, and then just open with any of your, like open with your browser basically. And then you'll see it says hello world, except it is in a different font and it's slightly different size, and Bootstrap has played with it a little bit essentially.
Yeah, another thing about this is because we deleted a lot of like all the code that we had before, we don't like the classes and the IDs and all those selectors and stuff are still technically there. They're just not being used. So if we were to give our H1 the class of blue text, it would still change to blue text.
In fact, we can do that here.
Yeah.
H1. If we set the class to blue text, oh shoot. It'll do the exact
And there you go. So yeah, nothing is lost. Usually, I guess technically you can declare your class first within your CSS file. It's not usually how I would go about doing it, but you can if that makes more sense to you. It feels a little backwards to me, but that's just me. Cool. So we're not going to go over all of these like meta tags and the other style sheet tag. That's just all like Bootstrap backend magic. That's not super important for you to know, and it's really easy for you to utilize. And we'll use that a little bit later. It just kind of smooths out a lot of building a site and lets you kind of ignore a lot of the nitty gritty like eyeballing that sometimes comes with like using this visual language. The main goal now is for us to build our own personal site, and we have a mock-up of that now that we can show you, just to kind of show you what we're building to in our end product, and give you a little idea of what you're going to be doing today. So this is our website about Josiah S. Carberry, a psychoceramics professor at Brown University, and you see these cards here under achievements. That's a little bit of Bootstrap stuff. We were able to like get these images lined up and get them within these like nice little like card formats using Bootstrap, which we'll show you how to do shortly. You'll see little buttons. All of them have like some kind of hover animation, as well as this nav bar at the top, which is very important. That lets us navigate to different parts of the website whenever, or just by clicking on them by using internal links. We also have a form at the bottom, which sends all of the information that is typed into that form to a website that we choose. And that's about it. Yeah. We've styled our website a certain way, but with the tools that we give you, you'll be able to style it any way that you'd like. And you can include any information anywhere. We just tried to cover as many things as possible on the site, just to give you an idea of all of the different things you can do.
One thing you'll notice is we have this images folder. This is something we're going to give to you guys. It's just some images. They're often called assets that we've used, that we've decided to create for the site, or to like download for the site and put all in one place. Obviously, if you're going to build your own like personal portfolio site or anything for a product or anything, you're probably going to want to grab these yourself, essentially. But essentially, they're just there so that we don't have to look up and download them during the time we're doing work. But we will show you how to reference them and how to use them. But essentially, we just have it in the same folder as our index.html and main.css.
So we're going to start really building our site now that we have a basic understanding of like what the structure of the site is going to look like, and we have this Bootstrap stuff plugged in. Again, really don't worry about it or be like daunted by it. We just copy pasted it, as you saw. So because we're building a portfolio for our favorite Professor Josiah, we're going to change our title to Josiah Portfolio. And like we said before, that'll appear in the tab of the website.
We got rid of the H1 just so you wouldn't need to see it. And then if you look in the tag, it's now Josiah Portfolio. This is the same as the finished site.
Yeah. And so the first thing that we're going to put into our site, and usually the first thing that you put into a site is called the nav bar, and you create a nav bar with nav tags. And yeah, you just do that with the NAV. So the nav bar is, like you saw on the first site, that just like little strip at the top that you can click to navigate to different parts of your website. Pretty straightforward. It's also good for you when you're writing your website because it lets you kind of like create a framework or an outline for what your site is going to look like. All right, so now that we have these nav tags, we're just going to really quickly fill out our the first item for what's going to be in our nav bar, and then we're going to explain it to you just to save some time and make things easier for everyone. So the first thing that you see here is going to be those div tags. So a div tag doesn't actually do anything on the screen. That is purely like an organizational tag. It's short for divider. It serves as a container for you to make your code more readable, make it easier for you to read, make it easier for other people to read. And you can also see that we put selectors there, which means that we can add as many tags as we want within a div tag, and then we can all style those a certain way if we so choose. But that's the only way you're going to like see a div's impact on the screen. And it's really just there to make your life easier. Next, you're going to see these UL tags. Now, a UL stands for unordered list. Again, with all these tags, you can add selectors. All of these selectors come from the Bootstrap documentation. That's why they're there. The names might not seem super intuitive until you read the documentation, so we highly recommend that. But again, it's not super integral to building a site. You don't need to use Bootstrap to build a site. It just smooths out some rough edges. So within our unordered list, the UL tag, you'll see that there's LI tags. Now that's just a list element. Those are going to, that's how you are going to show that there's a new list element each time. So each time you want to add something to your unordered list, you're going to create those LI tags here. Again, they have the class of nav-item. And within the list tag is where you're actually going to put the text that's going to show up on screen. So it feels like a lot of containers, but trust me, it actually is very, very orderly and will become quite intuitive quite quickly. So you'll notice before when we were talking about H1 tags and H2 tags and P tags, that's how we were putting down text. There's also another way to put down text, which is in the A tag. A tags are commonly used as links. So that's why we have that href selector in there, which is just a hyperlink reference. For now, we've put the £sign or the hashtag in there. That's just like common practice for having an empty link. We can go back to that later, but basically that will function later on as a way to, if you click on that on the site, it will direct you to that part of the site. It'll like move you to it. So if we wanted to create another list element for the site, we could very easily do that just by, in a lot of ways, copy pasting what we have already. Except this time, we would have the second list element be achievements, and then we would do that 2 other times for catering and connect rather. All right, cool. So as you can see, we've added a couple of other tags. It looks like we added a lot more than we actually did. If you take a closer look, you'll realize the only thing differentiating any of these list elements right now is they're containing text. Later, their href selectors will also be different. But for now, that's really as simple as it is. You'll also notice, and it's very important that I mention this, we added some selectors, a class and ID selector to our nav bar. Again, this is all from Bootstrap, just so that it will actually appear on screen and cooperate with other Bootstrap implementation that we want to use. So when we load the site and expand it, that's what we have so far. But yeah, so that's what we have so far. It doesn't look super pretty, but bear with us. HTML is not a styling language. We can add spaces in later. That'll be super important for readability, but for now, that's what we have. Now, moving on from our nav bar, now that we have the basic implementation of that in, we can move into our first section of our site. So in addition to a div tag, like I talked about earlier, there are also things called section tags. Again, this is part of the larger HTML hierarchy. There's whole like graphics explaining how that hierarchy works. So it goes section, then div, This isn't something that you need to like memorize at all. It's like something that I like actively look up because it's not like, it's very, very useful for basic structure, but it's not going to be like causing you a ton of issues. It's, again, all just for readability, all for organization. So within our section, just like everything else, we can give it a selector. So we're going to give it an ID of section A. But honestly, I think it would probably be better to be calling it about, because this is going to be our about section. There we go. And now we can go back to our nav bar and say about, yeah. So on line 19, we changed that link to now say hashtag about. And what that's going to do is that's going to, when the person clicks on that link, the website will follow the link and go down to the about section of the website. So now within that, we can put a div tag and we're going to give it a class of equal to container, and then another div class, which is equal to row. And again, these are all like ways to wrap up your code in nice little bundles, while also being able to take advantage of Bootstrap documentation. Again, we'll have a link to all this Bootstrap stuff, so you can know each, like you can pull it up as we're going through it. Like you can know each and everything that we're doing, and hopefully it makes sense why we're doing it.
So the way that Bootstrap essentially works is any Bootstrap document is divided into 12 columns, and then you can create rows. So like if you say, call -1, that's 1 column. If you say call -4, that's, like basically it's divided up into 12. So you can see how you can balance things out. But each of these obviously is a row also, if that makes sense. That's a clunky way of explaining it, but whatever.
Yeah, and there's plenty of really good documentation about Bootstrap online. It's just a lot of reading, good reading, but reading nonetheless. And that's not what this workshop is about. So now that we have these divs set up, we can start creating some things about our site. So within this, we can create one final Bootstrap div with a class that I'm not going to read out. We're just going to cut it in. Lucas, I'm going to send this to you right now because it's like just like long.
Cool. Okay, so essentially the way that we're now going to do this is we're going to say we're trying to create something that within the Bootstrap document structure is going to be 9 columns wide. Bootstrap essentially changes based on layout. So one of the things you'll notice about this site is that it resizes based on its width. And this is one of the biggest features of Bootstrap. It's that it resizes such that it works on mobile. You can build one site that will work on mobile, on desktop, on tablet. And so what you can do is you can set the number of columns that like an element will exist or will be for any different layout. So we want to set it to 9 for every layout. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to set it to class, and Bootstrap has this handy built-in thing where you go call LG9. So that means in a large screen, it's going to be 9 columns. Call SM9. That's going to be the same for small. Call 9. This will do it for extra small. Don't ask me why. And call MD9. We'll do that as well. And then we're going to set it to an ID of section, or we're going to set it to an ID of about text.
Perfect. Yeah, so that is what all that means. It doesn't look super clean, which is why I didn't want to read it all, but Lucas did a great job of explaining it. So now, again, we can finally start writing a little bit about Josiah Carberry. So all of these are going to, everything that we have in here is going to have a class selector of carb info, short for Carberry info. That'll come in handy later. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is have an H1 tag with that class of carb-info. And in it, we can just write whatever we want. For us, we're going to write about Josiah S. Carberry. And then we're going to have an H2 class, which is just a smaller font size, naturally, just to add a little style, a little HTML style. To make it look a little nicer, and that's going to read a real man with a real portfolio. And again, you can put anything there, but I'm gonna stop reiterating that. we're then going to add a p tag, which is going to describe his position at Brown University, which is Professor of Psychoceramics at Brown University. And then an H3 tag, just to show you again how versatile all of these little tags are, and how they do have different purposes. That will read qualifications as like a little subheader, and we're going to add another p tag that's going to say every single one.
One thing you will notice is that all of these are lowercase. If you use classes and IDs are both case sensitive. So this would not work if I made this carb info with a capital C, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Refresh.
Yeah. So that is our first little section. And again, the site doesn't look super nice right now, but that everything, it will all happen in time. That's why you can't see the nav bar right now. But usually when you're writing a site, we want to show you the code and everything as it's happening. But when you're writing a site, you're going to have it full screen, and that's what it's going to look like initially. And then you can go on and make some tweaks. So now that we have that, we're probably going to want to add, as you saw before, an image.
So as you recall on this site, you have all of this information, and then there's this image next to it. So you see this is 9 of the 12 columns within Bootstrap. So we can also add an image next to it for the remaining 3. So we're going to do div class equals, and then in the exact same way, we don't want spaces in between there. In the exact same way, we're going to do call LG3, call SM3, call 3, call MD3. ID is going to be about image. And then within here, we're going to add an image tag. Image tags are unique because, or they're not unique, but they're unusual within HTML because they don't have a closing tag. They just have this open. We're going to set the source or the src equal to where the image is. VS Code really, really nicely will do this for us. So we know that it's in the images folder. We're going to click it. We're going to hit Josie Carb. And then, so now if we refresh this and we put it up, you can see it's there. And it'll move around all nice. One thing that we also can add to images that's really good, just in terms of accessibility, depending on the readers who are on your site, is alt text. So like if you're blind, for example, and you use text to speech, or you have some way of getting this text in here, basically the alt tag is just to supplement people either whose computers are too slow to load these images or who like can't see images. So we might make this something like man in suit with brown crest on face, water behind, which describes the image. It doesn't do anything different, but it will show it if we are. Let's say I get rid of this image source, so it's not linked to anything. Then when I load this, it'll just say this basically.
Exactly, and that's how you're going to want to place an image in when you're using Bootstrap. You'll notice that it's all within the same div for the rows, and that's how you know that it's all going to be within that same row, and it is all going to line up accordingly. So that is going to be our about section for our professor. So that means that because we've finished up our section, we do have some the closing divs, but we also got to make sure we close up the section with that section tag. If you're not using VS Code, it might not do that automatically. So just like watch out for that, because you might run into some bugs that way. But that's, again, why we highly recommend using something like this. And now we can just dive into writing our next section. This section is going to list our achievements. Here we're going to use our Bootstrap cards. And so we can create this section and get an idea, or an ID equal to achievements. And again, we're going to use those two divs, those two Bootstrap divs with the class of container and the class of row, like we did before. Perfect. And now within the row div, we can create another Bootstrap div with these attributes. Sending them again.
I assume it's card group and like MX auto or something. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So now we're going to create a section of this that is, instead of this 9 and 3 like divided, we're just going to use all 12 of them. So we'll do class equals call 12, call SM12, call MD12, call LG12, and then MX auto, which will basically center it in the X direction, or like lengthwise.
Yeah, and here we're going to put in one H2 element that's just going to say achievements, and that's going to kind of be like the title text for the section. Again, because we've created this new section titled achievements, we can go back up to our nav bar, and as you can see, it's already been filled out. I missed that. Thank you. And now when we click on it, you can't see it now because the web page isn't long enough, but if we go to our fully built portfolio on the second one, and you click like catering, it will take you down. It will direct you to your catering services page and your achievements page. And that's going to be really, really useful as your site gets longer. It'll just get more accessible. But right now, you can see everything. So when you click on it, it is technically taking you there. There's just not enough content for it to like make that visual shift on the page yet. So now we can add in Bootstrap cards. So the way we're gonna do this is, again, creating a ton of divs. So the first div is going to read out, is going to have a class equal to card group. And then within there, we're going to have another div with a class equal to card and MB-3.
And MB-3 essentially just adds spacing at the bottom of the cards is essentially what that does.
Yeah. And now within this, we're going to use an image tag, which we just learned. So this image is going to have, because we're using Bootstrap with this image, it's going to have a Bootstrap class of card-image-top-img-top. And its source is going to be from our images file, and then it's going to be the sadpot.jpg. And now we can, after this, we can add another div with a class called cardBody. And there we're going to have an H5 with a class of card title. And that card title is going to say a distinguished member of Psychoceramics Academia. Sorry, 1 second. And then we're going to put a P tag in there with a class of card text. And yeah, you're going to see right now that that image isn't fully formatted right now, which is why it's like not super optimized and kind of blurry. And that's, we're going to add a P class with a P tag with a class of card text in there. And it's going to say, this one is sad. Crackpots make me sad. It's a shame sometimes they can be so beautiful. And now we're going to add an A tag with a hyperlink reference to Josiah S. Carberry's website. And then, or Wikipedia page, rather, not website, because we're on his website. There we go. And that's going to be the link. And it's Bootstrap class. It's going to have a couple. It's going to be button BTN and button primary, so BTN-primary. And within there, we're going to give it text of learn more. So if people want to learn more about Josiah Carberry, they can by clicking on that link. So now when we click on that link, it will take us to the page. Another thing that's really cool is if you don't want to
wait, we missed BTN. It's BTN and then BTN primary.
Yeah. So one thing that's really cool about the A class tags is that you can also give them a target. And if you set that target equal to blank, so it should be underscore blank, sorry. Now that's going to open it in a new tab. And that way you can kind of manage through them. You can also, like we showed you before, you don't have to include that and it'll just go to the next page. It's down to your preference. There are sites that take advantage of that and other sites that don't. If you're anti-tab clutter, then maybe you're just going to want to make it easier for your users. If you don't care, there's that option for you. Just thought I would throw that out there. And that's going to be our first card created. And now we're going to cut again and just fill in some more cards and then go over again, like we did with the list elements, some of the little differences and changes and how we're making things work. So as you can see, there's a little bit more text on the screen, but it's nothing new. It's all the stuff that we've already shown you. We just did it a couple more times with a little bit more content. One important thing to remember is that this is all within another Bootstrap row container, which means that when we go to the site and expand it, we're going to see all of our cards neatly lined up in a little row. And they're all going to have like the same structure, but as you can see, they're all kind of basically the same thing now that you know what's going on in the background. The images are automatically sized and formatted through Bootstrap and through this card function, which is super useful for us. And they're all put into that row thing with the other classes that Lucas talked about. And this is his achievements page. Now you know how to use Bootstrap cards and also insert images a little bit better, as well as manipulate or create like little buttons as well. And yeah, all of these have their own like little links to them, but they're not super important for us to show you. So next we can move on to catering, which is going to be our next section. Oops, 1 second. Cool. And this is again going to we're gonna kind of like go through the normal like Bootstrap formats just to set it all up again. By now it's gonna start to feel a little bit more familiar and maybe hopefully a little bit more readable. But again, it's basically just the same thing, also that the site stays like kind of organized and kind of on this non-visible grid or invisible grid. So we have our section class, or yeah, with an ID of catering. That nav bar link is going to be different now, just like that. And we are going to, we have our last div class with the columns all saying like the column on a large screen, the column on a medium screen, the column on a small screen, going to be set to 12. And then with another Bootstrap class of MX Auto. Perfect. And within here, we're going to have an H2 tag with no selectors, because that's still definitely an option. Not every tag needs a selector. With its content saying catering services, and then a P tag underneath with some items on the catering services, which is spicy wits, quesadillas, and Gouda grilled cheese. Cool. And now this is another really good use of like divs aren't just for Bootstraps. Like as we said earlier, divs are like great for just like making your code more readable for yourself. So while they do have that kind of like that functionality built in, they can also just be used to create like not super impactful containers. So in here, we can have a div with an ID equal to Joe's images. And these are just going to be images of the Joe's Diner at Brown University. And they are going to all use the image tags. So what we want to have here is some like simple little grid of images of the Joe's Diner at Brown University. And here we're just going to have, I believe, six image tags, all with different images of like things and areas of the Joe's Diner. Yeah, and all of these again are going to have that ID of Joe's images, which we will kind of take advantage of a little bit later. But for now, it's just there so that we know what it is, and if we ever want to find the Joe's images when we're like command Fing through the text, we can do that super easily. Okay, cool. So now we put in 6 more images. Again, these are all just from our assets file, which is why you have all that like images / spicy.jpg, all that. These were all gotten beforehand. When you're building your own site, you're going to want to get your own images, and they'll fill in this way. So now when we go back to the site, we should have all these images laid out. And yeah, they're there. You're gonna notice that again, like this doesn't look super great. Looking good is not HTML's strong suit. We will go a little bit more in depth in CSS a little bit later, but we just want to show you what you can do with HTML first and how we can lay out the site, just so you can actually get things on the screen, because it's going to be a lot easier to know what you're styling when you can see its effects after you've laid it all out. But we're not going to sit here and tell you that that looks like super, super good with all those like non-uniform images kind of randomly placed throughout the screen. But that's not what we're really trying to do right now. We're just trying to make sure that it's there, and it is, which is great. So now when we go back to our text, we've finished up our third section of catering. So now the last thing that we're going to want to do is go on to or get into our final section, which is going to be our connect section. So again, we can do the section ID equal to connect. And again, with the Bootstrap divs, with class container, then class row, and then and then all the columns with 12 and MX auto. Great. So we, at the very, very beginning, if you remember, talked about a tag and a function of HTML called a form. And so what that is you can, there are a lot of different uses for forms. You can add like radio buttons or different checkboxes, or just like, there are a ton of things that you can do. But basically, a form is a way for the user to input information into a form that you have on the site, and then that form and information will be sent to the link that you set it to. So in order to have a form on our site, we're going to need to have a form tag. And so you have a form tag, and it has a like a necessary attribute called action, and we're going to set that equal to the hashtag. And so if you remember, that's commonplace for when you have an empty link. So when you have your own website, you're going to replace that hashtag with its own link, and then all the information is going to be sent there. So you can have it sent to like an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, and the information will be filled in that way. There are a ton of really good uses for forms. We'll link some resources too to have you read more about them, because there's a lot you can do with them. And it's more useful for us to tell you that that information is out there than for us to like show you all of like the nuanced little things you can do, because it just gets tedious. So for now, we're just kind of going to use text boxes. We're going to give this an H3 tag that just says get in contact, and that's going to serve as the title. And yeah, it's as simple as that. So now, just because you can have like normal tags within your form little section, it doesn't really mean much. You also are going to need what are called like input tags. And so this input is going to have a class equal to form field, the first tag, sorry. Yeah, that's good. And it's going to have a type equal to text. So that's going to say that when they're typing, they're going to want to have, like the website is going to know that it's going to put a text box up. It's going to have a class of form-field. And it's going to have another thing called a placeholder. And so a placeholder is going to be like, if you've ever been on a site and you've seen a text box and it's had like this grayed out text, like user, like email or full name, like that. Great example. That's what that is placed in the website through placeholder. So this first thing is going to be called full name. That's also useful for you as you're reading through your text to know like what each input is, because an input is another example of image or another example of those tags where you don't have like a closing tag like you conventionally do for a lot of these other things. That's just how it is. But that's, you know, the placeholder becomes useful for that reason. We're also going to add a second input with the same class and type information, but this time it's going to be a placeholder with email. And Afterwards, you can also create something called a text area. And that's going to be like that larger text box that you saw. It's going to, again, have a class of form-field. And then we're going to give it a placeholder of whatever you want me to know. But this one, unlike the other inputs, does have a slash text area, like a closing tag. Yeah, I mean, it's not super intuitive and it's kind of hard to remember, but it's usually a pretty easy fix, because if you run your website and for whatever reason something's not working and you're working on a form or an image or something, you can just see if you have an image, if you have a closing tag, and if you do, get rid of it, and if you don't, add one, and if that fixes your problem, it's just because of like some random conventions. But it's pretty straightforward. Don't feel like you have to remember it. A lot of these IDEs also will just correct you right away and like fix it for you. So it's not super important to your understanding of how HTML works. And lastly, the users are going to need a button to submit all of their information. So we're going to create a button with the button tag. We're going to give it a type of submit. So it's not going to be a type of text. It's going to be a type of submit. That's how you're always going to have like submit buttons in forms. And this doesn't have placeholder text. We're just going to put in between the opening tag and the closing tag, just a submit button. And yeah, that's it. So now, again, we have the form. It doesn't look great, but that's all right, because it doesn't have to look great. It will start to look much better when we start using CSS. And so we will see you there. One last thing before we go is you'll notice that this button does not look nearly as good as the buttons on our cards. That's because this is actually an HTML button, not an A tag button like we had before. So that A tag is styled to look like a button with some Bootstrap magic. That's not what's happening here. They do have slightly different functions. That's just why this one looks that way and the other ones don't. And before we go, we also, so when you copy paste your Bootstrap stuff, sometimes it won't include the footer tags, and you're going to want to include the footer tags outside of the body tag. And that's just like some like closing things to put in your website. It's just good etiquette to have. We're not going to put anything in there because it doesn't show up on the website. But that's where you're going to want to put like copyright stuff and things like that. And so, yeah, this is the basic outline of our website. It doesn't look super great. It's going to look a lot better, like you see in just a little bit when we start learning some CSS. So we'll talk about that then. So welcome to our CSS page. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and this is where a lot of the styling elements of our index.html page come in. So as you see, we have this basic page here, but it's kind of prehistoric. It doesn't look super good, and that's what CSS is for. So if you remember at the beginning of the workshop when we were talking about style attributes, and we were saying style is equal to font, or rather like color, colon,
like when we were
whatever.
in trying to find a good example, like when we were in here and we would say something like style equals font size 12 pixels or something like that.
Exactly. So that is actually CSS embedded into HTML code. So theoretically you could code every CSS element like hard coded in that way. That's just like really, really messy, and that's why it's common for us to just make our own CSS file. This CSS file is already linked to the website or into our index.html page, like we showed before, which is how this site knows that it needs to take elements and like take properties from that CSS file and incorporate them there. And so now we're just gonna go over a little bit more of like what we did before, styling the fonts, giving them different font sizes, and giving the text a different color, just to show you what CSS syntax looks like a little bit more holistically. So I guess the first thing we're going to want to do is just set all H1 tags to have a font size of 12. And you're going to want to do this by putting that H1, a space, and then the curly brackets. And then
you'll notice that this got smaller, by the way.
Yeah, and so what
Serifs.
this has done is now all H1 tags in the site are going to have a font size of 12. Obviously, that's not something you're always going to want to do, and we'll get more into like how to specifically target things using the attributes and the selectors we've already spoken about to take advantage of that. But all of your CSS is going to happen within like declaring where it's happening with that H1 tag, or like it could be a P tag or an A tag or an ID or a class. And then you're going to, each line is going to have like its own little trait. So you're going to have like whatever you decide. For us, we did font size, colon, 12 pixels, and you're going to want to end all of those lines with a semicolon. It's a lot more like vertical on the page than index.html is. Like the lines are a lot shorter. So things look a lot longer. Like our CSS is like 200 lines, but it's really not like that much work. And a lot of it's just kind of like reiterating other properties that you already have. But that's actually kind of good because it just makes you make sure that you really are understanding and remembering things when you're going through. So sometimes it's okay to like reiterate yourself. All right, so we've set the font size to 12 pixels for all H1 tags, but what if instead of setting the font size, we want to set the color? We can do that simply by typing color in and giving it a color of blue like we did before. And so this is actually a pretty important thing. There are quite a few ways to declare colors in CSS. It's most common to use, or at least what I use the most, are just typing in the names like blue, like Lucas just did, or you can use hex code. Obviously, you get those from like sampling the colors in like Photoshop or something and then copy pasting.
Basically hex code. So hexadecimal is like, it's not really important for the scope of this video, but imagine, we have like our 0 through 10 number system. Imagine 0 through 10 plus 6 more, 16, like possible things. And essentially the way that hex works is you have 2 characters for red, 2 characters for green, 2 characters for blue, and they represent red, green, blue colors. So for example, like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 is complete black, and F, 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 F is just like pure white. And obviously there's a bunch of stuff in the middle. But like, for example, if you look up color picker on Google, as one might do, you can like sort of mouse around and click anywhere, and it'll give you the RGB. And then this is the hex code right here. Generally, it starts with this little hashtag or pound sign or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and you'll see there are a couple of other ways to identify the color. You have the RGB and the HSL. The RGB is just red, green, and blue because those are, for each pixel on your monitor, you have a red color, a green color, and a blue color, and they're all given values between 0 and 255. There's just like a lot of different ways for you to choose how you want to select your color. Hexadecimal is just like, it's good because it's pretty specific and pretty easy to alter once you like understand what you're looking at. But there's also HSL, which is short for hue, saturation of light. They're all just like different ways of doing the same thing. So, whatever feels the most intuitive to you, but honestly, you're probably just going to be copy pasting most of these things anyway. And speaking of which, so one thing that's important is like, as you saw, it's going to be kind of tedious for us to always type out like the hex code because that is something that we used for this project. So what you can actually do in CSS is declare variables, and you're going to want to do that within your body tag. So if you'll remember in our HTML file, we have everything encompassed within the body tag. You have the header above the body and then the footer. All of our code is happening in the body. So we declare all of the variables that we want to use for our body tag in there. And,
yeah, so wait, basically the way that variables work is they only apply to whatever scope you declare them in. So for example, if you declared a variable within the nav tag, you would only be able to use it to apply to things, or it would only be recognized within the nav tag and nowhere else. So we use body. You can also use like root, I believe, which I don't really, I mean, body is just the easiest in terms of declaring for everything.
It is also like, it's pretty common to use that root, as Lucas showed, to be a place where you can kind of declare universal variables. But we already collected some colors that we wanted to use for this and assets. So we'll just paste those in now and cut to them to show you how you're going to declare your own variables and what that syntax looks like. So you can see that we have put in our 3 constants that, you know, if you look back at the site, there's not too many colors going on. Usually you're not going to want
this
like,
red,
yeah.
this brown, this red, and then this little gold yellow. Those are the 3 colors.
Yeah, and then like the basic ones are white and black and stuff like that, which, you know, I mean, like there aren't too many ways, or they're all going to be the same. There aren't going to be too many nuances to like a white and a black color. So here you'll see just like basic syntax for declaring your variables. You do the 2 dash at the front, and then the name of the variable. You're going to see that there's another dash between each, like the full stack at brown, full stack at brown, gold. That's just, again, like we were saying before, you're not going to want to have spaces in your variable names because that will break the code. That's just not how the syntax works. The computer will not be able to read that. So that's just like convention to make it readable. You could like have FSAB brown all in one thing. It's just like harder to read. And in order to declare one of these variables, so if we want to use one of these variables right now, let's say we want to set the color of our H1s to the FSAB red. We're going to do that by typing var parentheses and then exactly what you see up top to get the red. And now when we run it, when we save the file and run it, we get that.
By the way, the way that I'm saving and running these is I just am refreshing the page every time. It's not too bad, but I realize that has not been working before.
Yeah, there are a couple of like things that you can download for VS Code in particular that will let you like run the site in real time. So when you save, it'll automatically update. But like it's all like different ways of doing the same thing. So we've given you a couple of examples of like what we want to do for our site or how we want to use CSS, but we don't actually, you know, I mean, like our H1 tags aren't going to be 12 pixels tall because that doesn't make a lot of sense. The whole point of using an H1 tag is so that it's like automatically bigger text. So we're going to get rid of that CSS and we're going to start actually coding. All right, so the first thing that we're going to want to do for real that we're going to keep on our site is just like before, we're going to style the nav bar first. And if you remember when we wrote our code, we identified the nav bar, giving it the class of class nav bar, fixed top, nav bar, and everything like that. These are all Bootstrap classes, but we also gave them an ID of Lucas. If you can just scroll over.
Nav bar responsive.
No, in the nav.
Oh, yeah, top nav bar.
Yeah, top nav bar. So now if we want to grab that and like access that area of our code, we're going to, because it's an ID, we're going to use hashtag top-nav bar. And now the first thing that we're going to want to do is set the background color of our nav bar to the variable of new red. And the background color isn't actually going to change the color of the font. So yeah, so it should stay when we expand it. Again, things aren't like compacting yet, but that's fine. The font color isn't going to change, and it is going to look the way it is right now. But now we've set the background color. Now we see visually where that space is being taken up, which is great. So now that we have our background color set to the new red that we want to change the font or the font color to white. The thing is, when we run this code, it doesn't actually change anything, and that's because it will automatically look for like P and H1 tags. It doesn't like HTML and CSS when you're setting the color won't look for like text within A tags because they're usually links and usually they're going to be styled to look differently anyway. So yeah, so when we go back to our CSS page, we can still access these just fine. We don't have to do any inline references in HTML itself like we did before. We can do hashtag top nav bar A. And now that's going to say for all of the A tags within the top nav bar ID, we're specifically altering those. And now we have those, we have all that text being white. Another thing that we can do is we can type text dash decoration, because you see that things are still underlining, and you can set it to none. And what this is going to do when we run it, it should, is it Yeah, perfect. So what that's going to do is it's going to get rid of that like underlining just to give it a little bit more of a minimalist aesthetic. Right now, it's not super clear if we're actually hovering over that, but if you remember, we have it expand. We have the font expand when it's hovered over. We'll go into that a little bit later. But for now, we just have it we just have it looking this way, just so like the underline doesn't pop in and out. It just looks a little cleaner. So now the next thing that we're going to want to do is give our nav bar a little bit more spacing so that the text isn't all bunched up together. And the best way to do this is by giving the A tags some margins. So we can do margins of left and right. So there are a couple of ways to use margins. The first is you can just type margin like Lucas did, and there's a clockwise rotation, so you can give all the values that way, or you can hard code the values from margin left, margin right, all of that. So the clockwise rotation, you're not going to see it because one pixel isn't too much, but
Yeah.
we promise you it's there.
Well, here, like here's like margin. So this would be, oh, it's not going to do it for me.
Yeah, that's because it's too small. But so it starts the clockwise one. When you just type margin like that, you'll have a clockwise order. So it'll start at the top. It'll give the margin value for the top, the margin value for the right, the margin value for the bottom, and the margin value for the left. Because the nav bar is a pretty horizontal space, we are just going to do margin dash right and margin dash left. You can also do it like that. Margin dash right, and let's just give it 10 pixels first, just so you can see it. So what that's going to do is it's going to space things out a little bit. It's going to make them look a little nicer. You can obviously play around with that to give your nav bar like the desired look that you want. So now that we have this nav bar kind of set up, we don't have the hover elements in just yet. That's just fine. We want to change the font a little bit because we have this basic Bootstrap font, but we actually selected fonts, as you can see on the finished page, to make it look a little bit more personalized. And so Lucas is going to take us through how to download and find fonts.
So in essence, you can download fonts from anywhere. There's fonts everywhere on the internet. I really like using Google Fonts because a lot of them are free. I mean, some of them you have to pay for. It's actually a library of, I believe, 900 fonts. But for example, what you can do on here is you can look at a font like Rgba, which is free, and you can click select this style for all of, like, it's generally easiest if you just import all of the styles for each font, and it'll give you what to put in your HTML to import it and what to put in your CSS. While we're at it, we're also going to do, let's grab Open Sans and get all of that. Although we should make sure we have all of it because, and we should also get Lotto. But hold on, if we look at review, we should add all of the styles of these just because. So these numbers, like the 300 and 400, they're what's called font weight. So instead of, in Google Drive or something, you might have, bold or, light. And in HTML and CSS, you can be a little more specific than that, and it's more of a range. Like this is 100, this is 300, this is 400. And clicking all of these here allows us to just pick between them when we're on the page. So anyways, here's the embed. I mean, you can see, if you look at it, you can sort of see how it's working. It's grabbing 100 weight, 300 weight, 400 weight for all of these. And it's grabbing it from Google. You also could just have you could download fonts and put them in a folder, like within your HTML CSS folder, but it's just sort of unnecessary. And some fonts cost money, and this is just generally easier. What we're going to do now is we are going to just set some base fonts. The way we've done this is that last font, Open Sans, we've set for all the heading tags, and we're going to use Lotto for the P tags. So you can do this fun thing in HTML where you select multiple types of tags at the same time. So H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. And then we can say font family, and then Open Sans. And then what you usually have to do is, since, for example, some browsers, just even if you have it imported, will not be able to deal with that. So you want to set a backup font. And for us, we want sans serif. This is something that's built into HTML. So now if we refresh, you notice all of the heading tags changed. Pretty cool. And then if we set the paragraph tags to a font family of Lotto and also sans serif as backup, you will get this, and you can see these are the fonts we're using on here. So yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, and you can get really most fonts that you would want to use using this method. It's pretty straightforward.
So one thing that we didn't do was we did not change these up here in terms of font. So we can do that also. We can set font family also to Open Sans and sans serif. One thing that we didn't do before is, you see we have this in pixels. Now the one thing is, if you had, for example, a really small website, you know, it's still really big text. And so sometimes what we want to do is use what's called relative sizing. One thing that we did before is we used absolute pixel sizes. One thing we sometimes want to use is relative sizing, so that it'll, like, instead of being 10 pixels, if you have a really small or really big viewport, it'll sort of adjust. So we can use what are called M's. We have to sort of adjust because obviously that's too much, but let's call it like, we can just sort of play with it until it looks good.
An M is usually about 16 pixels.
And an M is relative to the size of the container it's in. The actual like semantics of it are not super important, but if you use M's instead of pixels, your website will resize and be more dynamic in a better way. One thing we also didn't do with this is we can change the font weight on these. So for example, H2, we could change the font weight to 400, and you'll see it was like this. And that didn't actually make it that much bolder. It might be missing that. You can see that's 300 where this is 400, as you've noticed, and that changes both of these. And we could change this and make it really light. So like a font weight of 100 if we have it, which you'll notice is super light. So light, in fact, that it's actually unreadable. So we might go back up to something like 300 or 400. The point is, making changes like these in font weight and fonts can help your readability and just generally can make your site more interesting. One thing that I should note is everything that we're using so far is sans serif. So like if you notice the little tips of these letters, you see the little like decoration on the top and the little decoration right here and right here. They're really, really small. Or like, the little bits on the Y or the bits on the S. These are what are called serifs. We're using all sans serifs. Serifs are generally more readable. Sans serifs are generally cleaner, but there's obviously exceptions to both of those rules. This is not a typography class, so it's not that important, but generally like pair, sans serifs with sans serifs, generally pair serifs with serifs. We're gonna break our own rule later in this tutorial, but just a general thing to think about.
Yeah, one last thing about font weight too is like the convention for like when you can also give like a text decoration of bold, and that's the same as setting the font weight to 700. That's they're interchangeable, really only there, but text decoration does a little bit more than that. It removes underlines like we did before, like you saw. Yeah, so that'll change it. But it's really like font weight is used a little bit more because there's more nuance. It's more of a spectrum. Cool. So now we have this basic nav bar styled. We've also styled some of our H1, like some of our like initial text, and we have imported our own fonts. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is one of the things about sans serif that's really nice and really sleek and clean and modern is it feels more rounded off, and it's going to look a lot better. That feeling is going to be complemented when we kind of literally round out the borders of our images, so it doesn't look like they're pasted in. It looks like they're more like organically a part of the site. There's actually a really easy way to do this. So we've had those like general tags for H1, H2, H3, H4, H6 through H6 rather. We can also add an image selector. And what we can do for that is for images and a lot of things for backgrounds as well, you can set a trait called border radius. And we're just going to set this to 4 pixels. And what this is going to do is it's going to round out the edges. It's going to make it a little sleeker, look a little nicer. If we set that to 80 pixels, it should turn into like almost a circle.
Can we do this in M's?
Yeah.
what would
Yeah,
this?
you can probably do it in M's too. I would do 5 M's if you're doing 80 pixels. Yeah.
If you're doing 80, 5 M's. Yeah, 60
Yeah,
minutes.
and it's the same thing. If you really want that look, you can. That kind of looks like an airplane window to me, so it's not like what I would go for. But yeah, so you're going to see that all of these images are rounded out. You're also going to notice that in just one of our image cards, oh, never mind. For one
No,
of
this didn't round.
Yeah, so for 2 of the images, they didn't round, and for 2 of them, they did round, and that is concerning. So one thing that you're going to notice though is if you scroll down, you're going to see that these images look a little bit nicer too. We'll play around with those more, but they look a little nicer. They're not like so like grossly pasted in. But if you go to the cards actually looked a lot nicer when there wasn't that rounded off space, that rounded off like edge, because they had the rounded off edge at the top, and now it makes things look kind of uneven. So what we can do is we can go back to our index.html, and we can look at the tag that all of those images have. And this is taking advantage of the hierarchy that we were talking about earlier. So for our images, they're called card image top. That's the class. And remember, since we're using a class and not an ID, we're going to want to open this with a period. Card image top. And we're going to set the border radius to 0 pixels. It can be 0 of any kind. And what that's going to do is that's going to straighten things out again. So just, just a handy little tool. If you want to make like a sweeping statement and then have like some exceptions, that's a pretty easy way to do it.
Yeah, and yeah, basically the way that this is working is these images are being told first, okay, like have a border radius, and then second, like the one that takes precedence is card image top. And let's say we had set these, if we had set the like the ID of this to image 2 or something, then if we told that again to round the corners, it would round them basically. This is all about hierarchy, and these general like types for all types of one tag are the least specific and the most the easiest to override, I should say.
Yeah, and you could also style inline, but since we already have this encompassing class, it's easier to do it this way.
So one thing that you'll notice is, the site is starting to look better, but we've literally lost this whole heading. Basically, it's behind the nav bar. And also we had this nice little gradient, background splash of brown before and all this space. So we're going to add that in. We are going back to HTML. One thing that we should say is it was a little bit of a farce to say we're splitting this up between HTML and CSS, because the truth is generally you're going to be working in parallel, and a large part of styling is HTML. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add another row, and we're going to make it span the entire column. So call LG12, call MD12, call SM12, call 12, MX auto. And then from here, we're going to add a bunch of break tags. Now, what these do is they literally just create space. So we created margins before for styling, but these create actual space within the HTML document. You'll notice if we refresh, there's now a bunch more space. We might even want some more of it, and you can very much play around with this. Now that we've added in this space, what we want to do is we want to reference this whole about section, and we want to add the splash background, and we want to add the image. The other thing is you've noticed the text will go white. So once again, because it's an ID, we're going to use #about, which references just this section. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put this, so we can use this background attribute, and this lets us be very flexible. You can layer things. So the first thing we're going to add is what's called a linear gradient, which, a gradient is when you basically fade between 2 colors. A linear gradient is the same thing, but we don't actually want a gradient. We're just using this because it'll provide what we want. We've been using hex codes for some of the colors before. Here we're going to use what's called Rgba, which is just another one of these color schemes, just to sort of show you a little mix. So here's 0, 0, 0.45.
Yeah, and so Rgba is just red, green, blue again, and the A stands for alpha, which it just manages the opacity of the color. So it's, again, like another way to get like more specific towards what you want.
So you'll notice also we close, like you always want to close your parentheses. So you'll notice here, this is the first Rgba, this is the second Rgba, and then this closes the linear gradient. VS Code is really good at showing you what is closing what. So if we run this, or we have to add a little semicolon. So You'll notice this isn't working. It's because I added an extra parenthesis. We get rid of this, and we see we have this linear gradient. Unfortunately, we do not have this splash image. So then what we can do is we can add a URL. You guys know what a URL is from the internet, but here we can use it to reference an image, essentially a local URL that's just referencing something within our folder, not something online. So we're going to use images and then brown splash.jpg. And if we do this, yeah.
The get rid of the semicolon.
Oh yeah,
okay.
So there's a parenthesis. Wait, okay. So
that comma should be there. That comma should be there.
Yeah.
That was why
I'm missing a parenthesis here to separate the linear gradient from the URL, and then we have this image thing, and then the semicolon goes there. Sometimes, frankly, the syntax on here isn't always particular. First off, there, beautiful. The syntax on here is not always wholly logical. So sometimes, honestly, the best way to do this is just to play around with it, retype it out. You'll also notice that now this is really ugly because you have all this text. So what we can do is we can set color. Color always references just text, not background text or background color. We set that to white. We'll notice all of these change. Now this is still sort of bothersome. It's a little like we maybe want a little more space. So what we can do is we can go to the bottom of this about section, this bit right here. We can just use this section and add a few more breaks. And you'll notice that's a little more space. And there, and now we have this whole top section as was here. I mean, we're gonna do some more stuff to the nav bar as we go, but you'll notice it's done.
So now we have that background image with the linear gradient kind of fading over it. That's, if you look between the two websites, there's not really too much of a difference aside from what you're seeing in the nav bar, which is great. That means that we can move on to the next section. Just another thing to note is that with the URL, you can actually just grab an image from the internet and use the URL that way. It's interchangeable. That's how you're going to access like an image file in CSS no matter what, is just using that URL call. So moving on to the next section, you'll notice that it's a little close, a little visually cluttered to our first section. And so what we can do is we've shown you the breaks. That's a totally legitimate way to go about it. One of the perks of like using HTML and CSS is because it's so visual, there's a lot of ways to know that your like code is working and that you can like, there are a lot of different ways to do the same thing. But we want to show you that margin top also works. So we talked about margin left, margin right, and like clockwise margins. You can also do margin top. So for this is called the achievement section. I can't remember if it's a class or an ID.
It's an ID.
Perfect. So we're gonna call it with the hashtag. We're gonna set the margin top to 2M. Just why not? Just to play around with it. And what that should do is that'll give us some space. Again, feel free to play around with that to give it as much space as or as much or as little space as you want. You can also, let's just show them, you can also set it to -2M and it'll actually go up. You can also you can also do the bottom that way. Obviously that doesn't look super great, but sometimes it is good if you want to like make little micro adjustments. But we're going to leave it like this. So we have that little spacing up. The next thing that we want to do in this section is play around with the buttons. So we've already like kind of made the specific changes to the images and the cards that we really want to make. But there are these buttons here. They're not actually buttons like we've already gone over. They're A tags. So that means that when we want to look at them, we're going to call hashtag achievements A, space A. Now this is one way to call them. There are actually a couple of ways to call them, because if you go back to the index.html, you'll see, you'll see that they are within the Bootstrap card classes. So call them however you want. I just didn't remember the card classes off the top of my head.
Say button and button primary.
Yeah, you can do button primary, but I just remembered that this was achievements and A tags, and that's if your code is organized, it's going to be easy to do that. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is set the background color to brown, which is one of the variables that we have.
Or we have it as fsab
or
brown.
FSAB, yeah, fsab brown.
Flag.
Yeah, and you're going to notice there are these kind of ugly blue outlines right now, and that is okay. We can set the border to have none. Or we can also do background. Yeah, you can also set the background. That you can also set, if you type border and then var FSAB brown, it should also change the border to brown that way. Yeah, once again, multiple ways to do things. I think if you get rid of the border, it might actually, like, the border might not actually appear. Yeah, that's yeah, 2 ways to do that. But if you click on it, it should highlight like that. Now, again, we already got rid of the highlights or the underlining for our H tags above. It's just kind of, it looks a little nicer.
So one thing you'll notice is even though we've set the border to the same brown, when you click on it, you get this ugly sort of blue outline. Now, what's actually funny is when we were making this tutorial, we realized that we actually left this on this sample one and we hadn't figured it out. So, I seriously mean this. This is like arguably the most important skill of web design is learning how to find these things. So I literally Googled Bootstrap, button, highlighting, blue, remove or something. And I found this. This is Stack Overflow. This is a website that has a bunch of stuff. And I just read through. And in addition to outline none for button focus and button active, these are just referencing the buttons as they've already been sort of accessed, but we are already referring to the buttons here. So if we set outline to none and box shadow to none, and we refresh, you'll notice no longer does that happen. This is like the core of web design ultimately is like knowing how to Google your problems. And as long as you know what you're looking for, you don't really need to know any of this stuff. Even when we're building basic document structure, a lot of the time I have to look at old sites I built or Google it. Like, you don't really need to know anything. You just need to know what questions to ask, I guess.
Yeah, and you know, the reason we didn't notice this is because, like, when I was testing the buttons, I wasn't actually clicking on them. I was just checking their hover animations, which we'll talk a little bit more later. But like, I looked at them and I'm like, oh, that's good to go. But it wasn't. And that's just kind of how it goes. So embrace that. That's totally, like, you're never going to stop learning, which is great. So now we have these buttons here. They work, which is great. We'll go over the hover animations in a little bit. But for now, we have this background, or we have this section pretty much finished off. You'll notice if we go back to our site, this is mostly styled, but that is still a problem. And there's actually a really easy way to do this. If we just set in our achievements tag, because there's only one spilling over, we can technically like just go for this specific button. So we can do that by typing in an ID and just giving an ID of button 1. Remember when you're declaring attributes to not have those spaces in between, it won't like correct you. It's just like the common syntax. So if you set white space to normal, that's just going to fill things out. It's going to make things look a little bit nicer. And so it's all contained within the card. So
another note, this was something that I literally just looked up because we could not figure it out and it was working on the site beforehand. So this always happens.
Yeah, sometimes there are inconsistencies. And that's just how it goes. That's what the internet is for. So we now have a pretty much finished, aside from like the hover animations, which, like I said, we'll go over later. We now have a pretty much finished section here. And a lot of that is thanks to all of the automatic formatting that comes in with Bootstrap. And that's really the power of Bootstrap, is like, we haven't really had to deal with too many margins and too many paddings and too many like ways to center things because of Bootstrap's grid system and like built-in functionalities. It just makes things look really neat, really easily without having to manage with all of like we've already kind of demonstrated, kind of like the guess and checking that happens with CSS, because it is a very like guess and check oriented language, especially since it's like, it's very visual. So, you know, if you want like a slightly different pixel size, you just kind of run it and then you see if you like it. And if you don't, you go back to the drawing board, and Bootstrap kind of like gets rid of a lot of that and makes your life a lot easier. But yeah, this is our achievements page with these Bootstrap cards. So next we can move on to Catering Services. Here, it's just kind of a gallery of images. And we're going to start making these images look a little bit better. We're going to give them more spacing. We're going to make them look more universal. And so the way that we're going to want to do that is we're going to go to Joe's images. If you'll recall, we had that Joe's images tag. right there.
Yeah.
And if you go back to your CSS file, and that's, again, like we put that there because we wanted it to be like for organization's sake. But also it's something that you can very easily use in your CSS. So I would recommend, even if you don't initially plan on using an attribute to style it, I would recommend just putting them there, because you never know what you're going to use or what you're not going to use. You totally don't have to use them, but either way, like if it's there, you're going to know what it's referencing because it's written, which is super useful. But so we have Joe's images. And so for all of these, we're actually, there's a couple of things to notice here. So even though image is in the title here, we're actually referencing the box that these images are in. So it's not actually going to change a lot of the image properties directly unless we do Joe's images image for what we want to do next. So if we go back and we do Joe's images, then type image next to it, which is just a way to select all of the images, like we said before, within the Joe's images ID. We can set just a baseline width and height of, so a width of 600 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. You can also do M's or Rems like we've talked about. And that doesn't look great, which means that we can keep on playing around with it. The ones that we use on the site, for our site, the pixels that we use, are that we give them a height of 100 pixels and a width of 200 pixels.
So in terms of M's, it'd be like, a height of like 8-ish M's and maybe like 12 M's here or something.
Yeah, around there. And there you go. So that doesn't look super good. They're not like super spaced out. And if you recall, if we want to space things out, we can actually do, let's use margin, just like the general margin, and go through the clockwise this time. So we want to give it, let's give them 1 M of spacing on the top, just so we don't have them literally touching there. Let's give them 2 M's in between. So this will be for the right side. And then usually you're gonna want to keep it like relatively symmetric. So you'll do 1 M for the bottom and 2 M for the left. And now when we run it looks a little more spaced out.
One thing that you're gonna notice is some of these are a little bit squished, and so there's another property called object fit that essentially decides how these are determined. Normally, this will just HTML will just squeeze them in any direction to make it work. But if you want to like preserve like the aspect ratio, so instead of squeezing it, you're like cropping. You can do object fit, and then scale down will like put them to be like smaller in the box, which is not what we want. You see, like it does that. Scale up will crop within it, and you can see that looks a little bit nicer.
And also something to notice is when you notice that they seem to lose their border radius when they shrunk. That's because I think they're still occupying the same space, but the border radius, while it's there, isn't actually like visually affecting the images. So watch out for that. But this is, a pretty simple little page. We did a lot of like the heavy lifting when we were literally like finding the images and putting them in with HTML. And literally with just a couple of lines, we completely cleaned this up. If we were to note that out right now, it would go back to the way it was, which was really bad. And we don't, like Lucas, if you want to, we can. We can just delete it and it looks not great, but then we put it back in and it looks a lot better. It looks a lot more uniform and it looks just like much less, I don't want to use the word intimidating because it's not intimidating, but much less like concerning, much less concerning. We have these images, but they don't quite appear to be centered, and that's okay because we've really only been touching, we haven't been touching the images box, we've been touching the images themselves. The best way to center things like this is by using a higher level CSS concept called Flexbox. Feel free to look that up. It's a little tedious to explain, but we've linked an image with a ton of like Flexbox stuff in that you have access to that we like use a lot. But so it's super useful. It keeps things all in a box, lets you line them up. It's just it's just like a lot. It's not super important to your understanding of how CSS works initially, like at an entry level, and it kind of just like takes up time. But know that that's there. It's a super useful tool, and it'll make, you can do all these micro adjustments, sure, but you can also just use Flexbox. Know that it's out there.
if we're gonna, we can play around with it. You don't really need to understand this, but like if you're looking at one of these online diagrams, we're probably looking for space around or space evenly.
So we're not gonna like super go into detail about how Flexbox works and all the nuances of it. It's a super useful tool. We're just gonna kind of speed through how we'd want to implement like the space around, like we were talking about before, how we want to implement that. So we're going to go back to our Joe's images container. We can keep those margins that we have in place, but then we're going to give it a display value of flex. And we are going to give it a flex wrap value of wrap, which means that the items will wrap over if they need. And now we're going to give it the attribute align dash content, and we're going to say space around, and that's where that space around function comes in. All right, so there are a couple of ways to do this. They all involve using Flexbox, and essentially like the root of the problem that we're experiencing right now is that these images do not fit like the size of the page perfectly. And there are ways to fix that, but like we said, it involves a lot of guess and check, and that's not super, like, you guys are going to experience that at like no matter what skill level you're at with this language. And so I guess the moral of that story is like, make sure you're grabbing assets that you really are comfortable managing and using. These images aren't super high quality because we're not on campus. We can't like be taking all the photos that we want, but that's something to consider. It is important to note that this container, if you inspect element, it'll be a little bit hard to do on this page, or in Firefox, it goes at the bottom. So if we want to inspect element really quickly, so you'll see that this div is actually centered on the page. And what's not centered is the images in between. And the reason that that's happening is because the images aren't like a perfect size for the image or for the computer to be able to like perfectly space them out. That's totally okay. That's on us. That's the problem that's happening. It's also super tedious to fix, but super fixable. And we want to keep on like teaching you guys things instead of holding you up on this. So we're going to move on to the next part. This is how you would solve that problem. You would just like change around the images. You can either change the source image that you're using or their dimensions. You can use Flexbox like we talked about, but this is the limitation of using Flexbox, is that like sometimes things just don't work out super easily. We can also add like the 7%, the margin left and margin right to 7% and 5% like we went over. But like sometimes you just run into these issues. That's totally okay. This is how we decided to fix it. This is what the problem is. There are plenty of ways for you to fix it. But we're going to move on to the next section. So the next section is the final section, which is the contact section. And this is going to be our form. So in order to access this section, the form section, let's go back to our index.html file to make sure we know what the form tag is under. And so we put the form, we actually did not give the form an ID, but we don't need to, because we know that the ID for the section is called connect. So we can go back to our main.css. And we can type hashtag connect space and then give space form. So now that we have this, we are going to want to center things. And it's actually going to be a lot easier to do here. So we're going to set the margin left and the margin right values to 10%. And that should center our form. It's not going to look super good yet. That's okay. Just know that it's centered. Okay. Okay, so these things are centered.
One thing we noticed while we were doing this is in the beginning, we said that this H3 tag was within the form. We actually want it out so that we can move just the form and not its title. So we're going to move this outside of the form. And now we can reference just within connect the form. So if we say hashtag connect form, we can play with it, basically.
Yeah, so we are going to give it a display of flex. We're going to justify the content to center and align the items to center as well. And again, these are things that you can do. We're not going to go super in depth there. Centering things in CSS can, as you've already seen, can sometimes be unnecessarily complicated. But there are great resources online and they won't take up as much of your time, which is perfect. So now when we put it in, you will see that the content is centered, which is great. But one thing that we want to do is we want to use another aspect of Flexbox. So we see that everything's kind of like stuck together right now. That's not really what we want to do. We want to have it be more vertical because that's just kind of how this content usually goes. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to look back at our Flexbox properties, and we're going to give it a value of space around.
For align content?
Oh, you know what? You're right. So we're actually going to give, each individual input. So here's how we're going to do this. So in order to give each of these things their own individual line, because Flexbox is ignoring the break tags that we put in, we're going to do hashtag connect input, and then we're going to give each thing clockwise margins of, let's do 1M first, just to see what happens. Now when we save it, things are more spaced out, but they're not spaced out enough. Let's keep on going through. Flex wrap. That is another thing that we're going to want to do. And now we're going to want to expand. So that will actually allow the items to wrap over. So now we're going to expand the horizontal M's. That'll definitely do it almost. Yeah. So, and then we're going to keep on, we'll make sure to do 7. Well, we want to have it be even on both sides. So let's do 8M. Let's do 9M for the left and 9M for the right. And that'll just keep things even. So we're going to want to do that. Let's do 10. We're going to do 12M and 12M. It's really like, this is how it goes. 12M, and that will center things slowly but surely. Do 20M, like just completely overkill. And there we go, which is great. So we're also going to see that button is still kind of in its own little place. So what we can do is, so what we're affecting right now, and this is actually good. So don't do hashtag connect button. If you'll remember that whatever you want me to know section is actually a text area thing. So we're going to give it the same dimensions as before, except we're going to do hashtag connect text area. And we can just copy paste that line. So one thing that's useful is if things go over the screen when you're doing margins and stuff, it's not really seen. So if you just like want to brute force, like not brute force it, but just kind of like get it over with, you can kind of do overkill. And now finally, we do have a nice centered form on our page. Sometimes that's how that goes. But this is how you do that. That's how you properly use Flexbox. And this time we don't have any like kind of irritating images, which is our bad. You know, like we should have collected images a little better. That will be getting in our way. So you can set the width to 15M. We're going to look at our form, and we're going to set the width of the and height of the form to be whatever we decide. So let's do 10M. Let's do 12. Yeah. So we'll do 15 for all of them. We're also going to set the width of our text box to 15M. And when we have like the standard thing that way, it's going to be a lot easier. There, like instead of like trying to find the width of the container, you can just do it this way.
Oh wait,
and
so one rule generally in programming is don't repeat yourself. So you've noticed we've set all of these to 15M. So another thing we could do is we could do connect input text area button with 15em, and we have not repeated ourselves, and we've applied this everywhere. You also could do input text area and get rid of this, and once again you just save some lines of code, and perhaps it's a little bit clearer.
In fact, you could probably just get rid of that top one and copy paste the margin into that lower one as well.
Is that gonna mess with the button? It's the one
thing it shouldn't. I mean, like the button is gonna have the same spacing.
Yep,
so
nice.
Yeah, perfect. And that is the spacing. Again, like as you just saw, there's a lot of guess and check. A lot of it was edited out, but believe us, it's there. So now we can get into some things that make it look a little bit nicer, because this form is like, okay, it's centered, but it's still very bare bones. So what we're gonna want to do is we're going to go to our feedback, or like we're going to look at our form, and we're going to give the border radius, let's set the border radius to 4 pixels again, just to give it the same like universal, or 0.25em. It's still connect. Sorry, that's from an older.
Border radius
of 0.25em. That's going to round it out a little bit. It still looks a little gross. And so there's ways to get around that. So we're going to set the border style to dashed, and that's going to get kind of rid of that ugly shadow. And there you go. That way it just looks a little sleeker. Again, kind of what we're going for. And now what we're going to want to do is we might want to, usually text boxes are a little bit like longer. So if we want to like just now specifically target the connect text area, we can just give it a height of, let's say 10 em. And if we're not happy with that, we can change it. So now we have it just spaced out a little bit more, but again, so one thing that I'm realizing is we actually don't want we don't want our button to have that dash style because it kind of looks like it's an added on thing. So we can actually go in and specifically target that one, hashtag connect button, do border style, none. And now we have that sleeker look. So now we're gonna play with this a little bit more. We're gonna set the background color to brown, or our constant brown. And that will set the background color. But now we're gonna wanna make that look white. And we also, have we changed the, so because this is a button, not an A tag, like our other like visually looking buttons, we needed to change the font again. So I'm glad that we just did that. Perfect. So if we scroll around, this is kind of like the basic look of the site, but it's still missing like some like user interactive flares. So the first thing that we're going to do, a lot of that is done with hovering or hover elements. So the way that we're going to do that, we're just going to work back up. So we'll start at the submit button. So if you go back down all the way to the submit button, if we look at this connect button, we can create another, we can set its transition to 0.1 seconds. And this will make sense in a second. So if you set its transition to, yeah, within there, transition 0.1 seconds. And then we're gonna create a new little thing called hashtag connect button. And then after that, it's gonna have a colon and hover like that. And so now whenever we hover, it's gonna transition over 0.1 seconds to do what we want it to do. We're gonna change the color like we did before to a background color of yellow, or the golden yellow, whatever we have, our constant. And now when we hover over it, so that might be a little bit too fast or a little bit too slow, according to what you like. You can play around with that, but that's how you do that. So can you hover over that? And it stays that way. Perfect. So we'll go into this a little bit later, but sometimes your animations will reset, and there's a really easy way for us to fix that. But that's a slightly different thing. We'll go over that later. So now we know how to do that. But so we can change the color, but you'll notice if you remember at the beginning, on our original site, we have the buttons kind of like fill in with like the red gradient. So the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna go to our A tags in our cards. Okay, so we've also set the font family here. We noticed that we didn't do that before. So we're gonna set the transition to 0.1 seconds again. That's just kind of like a standard. You can set it to whatever. It just is like, it controls the time at which this little animation you want to happen happens. So the other thing that we're gonna wanna do is we've talked about box shadow a little bit already, but we're actually gonna take advantage of it to animate it now by setting the box shadow of these tags to be inset, or yeah, inset. We're gonna do 0, 0, 0, 0. That's that clockwise notation again.
Oh.
And then we're gonna set the variable to new red, or our FSAB red. But if we do the box shadow inset 0, 0, 0, if we put that content in the top, in the top A, we'll notice that it doesn't actually change anything. So put it in, but it's important that it's there. So we'll notice that it doesn't actually change anything. We're also gonna set in the transition, we're gonna give it a value before the seconds that's gonna say ease out. And then after that, we're gonna go into our A:: hover section, and we're gonna type in the box shadow again. And the only thing that we're gonna change from the line before is that first 0 is gonna be replaced with 300 pixels. And this value doesn't need to be super precise. It just needs to make sure it's taking up the whole box. And now when we hover over it, it's happening too fast, but so we're gonna change it to 0.5 seconds, yeah. So you'll see that it's expanding and contracting horizontally like that. And that's just a cool little way. to like give your users a visual cue that it is like registering the fact that you're about to click on it. So that's another thing that you can do with the box shadows. I really like that. I think it looks really cool. But there's one last thing that we want to show you with the hover interactivity, and that's going to be on the nav bar. So right now when we hover on the nav bar, it doesn't really do anything, and to the point where you don't even know if it works. And that's another reason the nav bar, like these hover elements, I personally like really like them, is because I know when the computer is reading the fact that I'm like clicking on something, even though it usually is. So we'll do top nav bar a dash hover. And for this, we actually want to, we're going to want to set we're going to want to do transition 0.1 seconds in the top one again. And we're going to set the font size to, let's do 2M, because I'm pretty sure that's larger than what we have. Right? Oh, wait. Yeah. So now when we hover over it, it's going to expand. And that's going to give it like, you can slow that down or speed it up. One thing about changing font size is sometimes it'll like clip between like uneven values and it'll make it look choppy. So if you do it fast, it kind of smooths over that. But if that's moving a little bit too fast, you can also play around with it. So when we were doing this this way, we actually noticed something that we didn't run into before, which is when you hover over the middle of it, it kind of, the computer isn't quite sure like whether or not the mouse is actually on it because it's on the border. So the way we change that, and that can actually be like dangerous for people who are like extra sensitive to screens. So the way we changed it is we noticed in our index, we were accessing all of our nav items, or all of our nav bar items that way. And so we just changed what we were referencing, and now it's a lot cleaner, and it still works.
Oh.
Yeah, it still needs to be nav item A.
And
but
the other thing is, we're just gonna make this look a tad nicer. If we do margin left 1M and margin right 1M, it'll be a little less set from the back off, even though the space will be the same.
And that is how you do that. The last thing that we really want to go over is we've covered like basic animations, but there's also something that you can do when the site loads in. So if you've seen some of these newer sites, when you load in the page, things kind of like float in from the sides. And there's a really easy way for us to do that. So we have, and it doesn't involve hovering because you're not going to be hovering on anything when it's loading. So the way you're going to want to do that is, let's do it for the first item. Let's do it for the nav bar. So in our nav bar class, the top nav bar, we're going to give it a value that says animation, and we're going to give this animation a name of fade down. And we're going to have it happen over 0.1 seconds, or actually 1,000 milliseconds is usually animations go in milliseconds. And then we're going to give it, we're going to end it there for now. And we're going to set the opacity to 0. And that's going to mean it doesn't appear right away. And now, right below that, we're going to create a new, so it doesn't appear right now, which is supposed to happen. Now, we're going to go underneath and say at keyframes. And we're going to call fade down there. No, it's going to go at the top.
Oh, at keyframes fade down.
Yeah. So this is now, we're calling, when we load it, we're calling the keyframes that are going to be described here. So what we're going to say, the way this works is you have a from statement with your 2 curly brackets and a to statement with your 2 curly brackets. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a from that's going to say opacity 0, which is what we have. And we're going to have a value called transform, which changes where the thing is on the page. We're going to set the transform y. So transform is equal to translate y to negative 20 pixels. And that's just going to literally move, it's going to transform and translate the location of the nav bar to 20 pixels above the screen. And then we're going to say to opacity of 1. And we're going to transform that to translate y of 0 pixels, which just is where it is normally on the screen. And so what's going to happen is CSS is going to fill in the blanks of those over the course of 1,000 milliseconds to make a smoother transition. So if we save that and load it, you'll notice that it disappears right away, but you saw it fade down. So that's actually, no, that's okay. I promise it's okay.
I trust you, yeah.
Yeah, so the reason that that's happening, and I actually left this out on purpose because it's something that I would forget to do and get really confused with at first. The reason that that's happening is you need to go to animation again, and there's one last thing that you can include called forwards. And if you type forwards, it will keep that animation there. And now it's just there and it loads in. So that's how you do that. We're going to show you a couple of other things that you can do with it, specifically fade in from the left, or fade in from the left side of the screen and fade in from the right side of the screen, and you'll kind of get the idea. It's very straightforward, but it looks really nice as it loads in. It makes things literally feel like they're kind of like floating in and coming together. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make a from left animation, and that's going to go in our image section for the Josiah Carberry photo that we have up there.
That would be,
And
I believe, about and then image.
Yeah, so if we do about image, so we actually haven't really done too much with it yet. If we do about image, we want to give it an animation called from left. We're going to give it 800 milliseconds this time and forwards again, because we know. And we're going to set its opacity to 0. And underneath that, we're going to do at keyframes from left. And then we're going to set the from and the to have an opacity of 0. Then we're going to transform it from x of negative 20 pixels on the left side of the screen, and then transform that to an opacity of 1 to translate x 0 pixels.
I'm doing it in EMs.
Yeah, you can do it in M. You can do it in anything. The reason I was using pixels here is because it's all coming from off the screen. So you don't really need you don't need it to be relative because it doesn't really matter. But now when we run it and load it, it all loads in right at the same time. So there's something that you can do, because that seems like a little sudden. You can actually add another thing in to your animation called animation delay, and that's going to go in. That's going to be on a separate line. It's not going to go. Yeah, just put it under opacity or under animation in your about image. Animation delay, and we can just set that to 400 milliseconds. And now when we load it, you'll see that it loads in a little bit afterwards, and that just makes things kind of feel like they're coming in sequentially. The last thing that we're going to do is go through and load in the text kind of the same way, except this time from right. So we're going to access the about. There's a container containing all of this text. If you go to index.html, and if there's not, we can make one. But I'm pretty sure there is. It is about text.
About text, yeah.
Yeah. So if we go to main.css and about text, perfect. We're going to set its animation to fit from right. Let's do 600 milliseconds just to give things their own kind of personality, opacity of 0. And let's say that this delay comes in at 600 milliseconds too. So it comes in a little bit later, just so things are kind of all taking their time. Keyframes from right, yeah. And then we're going to do from opacity of 0, and the transform translate x of 20 pixels this time because it's to the right. 1.2M, yeah. And we're going to do 2, opacity 1, transform translate x 0M. And so it all, make sure there's a semicolon. So again, it already is very, very straightforward and super, once you understand the syntax of how to do it, it's super, super easy to do, and it looks really nice. So we've showed you how to style your website with a ton of different CSS elements, implementing Bootstrap. Sometimes you can run into problems along the way. That's totally okay. That's just going to be part of coding no matter what language you're learning.
Oh, can we add the little FSAB thing on top for them?
Yeah, we totally can. So we're going to do that now. Okay, so the last thing that we're gonna want to do is, if you want to include a link to the host website or the brand of whatever it is you're working on, which is what we're doing with Full Stack at Brown, which you saw at the beginning but is not present here. You can actually, so you can take advantage of Bootstrap again, and outside of your div that contains your unordered list, you're going to do you're going to create an A tag, and you're going to set the link to, or you're going to have the A tag class be equal to some more Bootstrap values, which are going to be Nav Bar -brand, JS-scroll-trigger, and that's going to be it.
Oh, yeah.
And then you're going to set the hyperlink reference. For us, it's Full Stack at Brown. So we're going to do https://www.fullstackatbrown.com. And then we're just going to fill in full stack it brown like that, like we do. And that's going to appear. One thing that we're going to want to do now is we can go back to our, let's give it an ID of FSAB. And now when we go to our main.css and do hashtag FSAB, so the font that we use for full stack it brown is called Roboto Slab. We have already shown you how to grab fonts, and we have this one copy pasted. It's very easy to do. We'll just, you know, like it's what we've done before. You already know how to do it. And now we're going to go back to our main.css. And we're going to set the font family. And it's going to be Roboto space slab comment. And this is actually going to be serif.
Oh yeah, you're right. Because this is a serif font.
Yeah, and it is a serif font. So yeah, like Lucas was saying earlier, it is like a fallback, and that's the color white. And that's how you do that. So now if you also click on full stack it brown,
you know what
it'll take you to the full stack it brown site.
This will do it. One thing I think we also forgot to do, I just realized, is, and this is also a very common development pattern of just realizing stuff to do. I believe this needs JS. So yeah, we added in these JS scroll triggers, and now you can click on all these things. And so we're already in the About section. If you click on the Achievement section, it'll navigate us down to here. If you click on the Catering section, it'll do the same. Contact section. These are all just going to the ID. So this is saying go to the ID About, go to the ID Achievements, go to the ID Catering. And these are things we had already in the document, essentially.
This happens automatically without Bootstrap. You don't need the JS scroll trigger to have those like internal links work. But
yeah,
that makes it look a little nicer, which is what Bootstrap is all about. Hopefully, we've made that clear enough already. If not, I'm so sorry. But yeah, this is the basics of how you're going to want to build a site. Obviously, a lot of the layout of this site isn't super practical because it's not super consistent, but we wanted to show you as many different things as you can do. Obviously, like for your own site, you're probably not going to want to have too many bells and whistles, like different bells and whistles on all your buttons. But we wanted to show you all of the tools at your disposal. HTML and CSS are super powerful. They're actually super easy to learn, but they look really, really impressive. Like just a little bit of extra flair, and it looks really, really impressive and really like polished up, all without even needing to use JavaScript.
Let us know if you have questions. Our emails will probably be somewhere around